All I'm asking is for a little less stress when I get home. Hey, baby, when I get home. That's right. Stress. Today's presentation will be all about stress. First, we're going to take a look at the definition of stress. We are going to look at the stages of stress, personality types, causes and consequences of stress, coping strategies of stress, and balancing your work and your home life. Let's first define what stress is. Stress is a person's various responses to extreme physical and psychological needs. You might see stress manifested by people biting their nails, someone getting easily agitated when they're under a lot of stress. There are two types of stress. One type of stress is called eustress, which is actually a pleasurable type of stress that accompanies a positive event, like winning the lottery. The second type of stress is called distress. Obviously, it is an unpleasurable type of stress that accompanies a negative event. For example, my young children arguing when I have tons of homework to do, and it makes it very difficult and stressful and hard to focus. Now we're going to move on to signs and symptoms of stress. If you'll take a look at the slideshow, there are various signs and symptoms of stress behaviorally, physically, cognitively, and emotionally speaking. Physically, if your body's under stress, you may have shortness of breath, you may have muscle tension. If you have behavioral symptoms of stress, your eating patterns may change, for example. You may bite your nails. You may also be a procrastinator because you're trying to avoid the inevitable. Cognitively speaking, you may not be able to concentrate. You may have a hard time remembering things, very forgetful. And emotionally speaking, you may have anxiety. You may be very irritable and extremely sensitive to things going on around you. Now, the stages of stress that takes a toll on the body are the following. If you'll take a look at your next slide, the general adaptation syndrome model for stress starts off with each of us having a normal level of resistance to stress. However, this needs to be noted, according to our textbook, some people can tolerate stress a little bit better than others. The first stage is alarm or panic, and this is when we try to think of a way to resolve our stress by either fighting against it or running away from it. We may delegate a lot of the tasks that are stressing us out, or we may resign from the position entirely. Stage 2 is resistance, and this is when a person is trying to hold it all together in the midst of this large amount of stress. Previously, when I was taking two graduate classes at the same time, I found myself in the resistance stage. I had two very large assignments due at the same time. I was finding myself staying up very late at night and getting up very early in the morning so I could have a quieter environment to work when my children weren't up and making lots of racket so I could think better. But eventually, that does take a toll on the body, which takes you to stage 3 of this syndrome, which is exhaustion. This is when a person has prolonged exposure to stress, and of course the resolution is you give up. Eventually, after being exposed to such prolonged stress, I did have to take off work. Something had to give, so I could catch up on my rest one Monday, and then also just some of the household chores around the house. There are different types of personalities, if you'll note on the next slide. You have type A, which is a very competitive, very committed person who has a strong sense of urgency. And then you have the type B personality, which is pretty well the opposite. They're not competitive, they're not as committed, and they definitely have a weaker sense of urgency. Most people have a combination of both. I find that interesting. You might assume also that type A people would actually be more successful, but the textbook points out that that's not necessarily true, because type B people may in fact have better interpersonal relationships and reputations, whereas a type A person might alienate others because they're so driven on focusing on their tasks that they miss opportunities because they are trying to get ahead. Now, I'm going to give you an example of a type A person versus a type B person personality. I'm predominantly a type A person. My husband, on the other hand, is mostly a type B person. And last Wednesday, when we were getting ready for our Easter program at church, I immediately went into the church. I started setting up all the technical devices, telling the children to go get in place because we had just so much time to rehearse. However, my husband, on the other hand, came in, and he was probably 5 minutes entering the building after me, and I said, "Why are you coming in here so late?" He said, "Well, I had a hankering for a piece of gum." That right there is a great example of type A versus type B. No sense of urgency whatsoever, and actually the program turned out well. Now, you can have hardiness. Everyone has a level of hardiness, and this is just the ability to cope with stress. And you also can be an optimistic person. A different level of optimism may be noted depending on your perspective. Some people may see things more positively and others more negatively. For example, is the glass half full or is it half empty? And of course, whether the amount of hardiness that you have or your perspective of optimism depends on the person themselves, their cultural views, their gender, and even the way they were raised. Several factors can influence this. There are several causes of stress, if you'll note on the next slide. They come from two places, obviously your organizational or work stress and your home life. Taking a look at your organizational stress, you'll note the chart. There's 4 main areas in the organization where stress derives from. The first is task, the job itself. For example, if you are a first responder to emergency situations like a fireman, a policeman, an EMT, paramedic, you have a very difficult job with a very hard task as your job is laid out. Physically, you could have stress because of the environment. For example, my husband, he works in the maintenance department outside most of the time, where he's subject to hot and cold weather. And another form of stress is through your role that you play. You can experience role overload, and role overload is when you have a momentous task that really should be the workload of multiple people all piled on your back. Also, there could be an instance of role ambiguity, which causes you stress, which is when your job duties is not specific, it's very unclear. And you also may end up with stressful interpersonal demands. And this is when you have a lot of pressure on you. You're in a leadership position, or there are personality conflicts that you have to deal with. As a theater director of a junior high, I find many times that there'll be some drama and some bickering within my company. And while I still have to direct the show, I have to be a great manager of personalities as well. And at times that can be very stressful. Secondly, there are stresses at home, which break down into 2 categories. The first is life trauma, obviously when something negative happens, like a family death. And also the second form of stress is when you have a life change. This could be if a family is building or purchasing a home. You could also find yourself in the midst of role conflict, which is when your expectations at home and work collide. For example, as a theater director, there are times when I have to stay late for rehearsal, but I need to be at home with my husband and my children and be a mom and a wife. And I find myself in the midst of role conflict. Now, all of this stress takes a toll. So there are consequences. You'll take a note on the next slide. Individual consequences of stress can manifest themselves behaviorally. You may get agitated. You may be a stress eater, for example, or you may end up resorting to alcohol and drugs to help you to cope. Psychologically, you can become depressed. You may be a type of person that sleeps too much, or you have panic attacks. Medically speaking, you could end up with heart disease, have strokes, or even stomach ulcers. Organizationally speaking, there are consequences as well. Stress manifests itself in the organization through performance decline or withdrawal. People will begin to call in sick, or they may look for a new job just to get away from the stress. Their attitudes may change. They may begin to complain a lot. And a person can experience burnout when on the job. And this is when a person's level of dissatisfaction outweighs their satisfaction on the job. As well, signs of burnout may include fatigue, frustration, just feeling very helpless under the burden of overwhelming demands at work. Now, some solutions to coping with all of this stress, as you'll find on your next slide, can be done as an individual. Individuals can exercise, and this will help to reduce stress, relax, go on a vacation, participate in a hobby. Be a good time manager. Make a to-do list with the most pressing things at the top and tackle them in that order. Also, manage how many roles that you take on. If someone is constantly asking you to do something, you've got to learn to say the word, "No, I'm so sorry, I cannot." That way you don't have too many irons in the fire. Also, you could join a support group. People who have like interest as you do, who know what you're going through. You can visit with them, vent to them, and this will also take off the burden of so much stress. Organizational coping strategies, on the next slide, are number one, organizations can have institutional programs, and this is when they design work and the work schedules in a way that helps the employees to avoid unnecessary stress. Also, organizations can create collateral programs to help manage stress. For example, at our school, we have a health and wellness committee, and what they do is they encourage the district employees to exercise and to eat healthy and just live well. Also, there is a balance in work and life. If you'll take a note on the next slide, I know it's easier said than done, but one can help themselves by, number one, choosing a job with a schedule that's flexible enough to have a personal life. And number two, recognize long-term versus short-term perspectives in the balance of work and home life. And finally, know what your trade-offs are and what you're willing to give up and what you're not. If you're a type of person that does not believe in working on Sundays, then certainly don't take a job which requires you to do so. That can cause you a lot of stress. In conclusion, this has been a presentation over how to manage stress and balance your work life at home. So whether you listen to Aretha Franklin or sing and dance like the stars, make sure you stress less. And finally, my question for you is, what does the Bible teach us that we can do as Christians to help us to deal with stress? Thank you.